Hi, so today I'm going to have a go at showing you how to do a button Christmas tree. I've seen quite a few of these on Facebook and Pinterest, so you might have seen some too. They're fairly simple to make, provided you can lay your hand on a fairly decent selection of buttons. Now I've got quite a big extensive button collection. I've got various pots, some of which I've accumulated over the years. Some I've bought from places like Hobbycraft. They do quite big mixed packs, and often the mixed packs have all different sizes, colours, shapes. This is a pot full of tiny ones, but they were mixed together with some of the bigger ones, and I've even got some that are bigger still. Some of them I've acquired from people who've had a button collection they were trying to get rid of. If you don't have access to go and buy buttons, it's a bit tricky at the moment. Places like The Range, Hobbycraft, even Aldi often do a fairly decent selection of buttons without having to spend too much money, and you can probably easily buy them on the internet. But you might find that you've got buttons laying around either from spare buttons that have come on items of clothing that you've had from the past, or you might have old clothes that are ready to go in the bin that you can take buttons from. You probably find there's odd ones down the back of the sofa, or maybe that's just my house. So really there are only two things you need, and that's buttons and something to string them on. The buttons, it's up to you whether you choose to kind of give them a colour theme. This one's a sort of fairly traditional green Christmas tree, but these two I did in mixtures of colours. Got this one's a little bit more funky. But literally, use whatever you've got. They don't even necessarily have to match. You could literally just take any random buttons that you can put your hands on and use them. I've also got some buttons which are specific shapes. So these ones are star shaped. I can't remember exactly where I got them from, but probably just somewhere like Poundland or The Range. I wouldn't have spent very much, but I've got a few of them in different colours. I've got pink, I've got purple and blue as well. But what you might find is if you do go for something like one of the big mixed packs of buttons from somewhere like Hobbycraft, what I found is that often, in amongst all the fairly bog standard basic buttons, you also get some that are a little bit different. They've got slightly more decorative finish on them, and these ones also don't have holes. These two have a slot to drop your thread through. So for the tops of your trees, you don't necessarily have to go and find yourself something specifically like a star. Some of these can look just as good. This one, instead of a star, I've got a flower shaped button. Often a lot of the children's ones are a bit more novelty shaped. You can often find on market stalls or some of the smaller independent haberdashery type shops. You can buy buttons singly from a tube. You tend to find the buttons are shown on the end of the tube to show I've got a pack of these as well. I might see if I can use that on one of mine. So I've already made 3, and what I'm going to do is show you how I made them. So I've got a selection of buttons. I'll slide everything out of the way in a second and show you. You'll need, probably, depending on how big your buttons are and what kind of a selection you've got, you probably need anything from about 8 to 12. You could do more if you've got that many more to use. But you just need enough to be able to make something tree shaped, and ideally, if you can see what I've got here, they graduate down in size. So I'm going to start with some big ones and I'm going to work my way to some smaller ones, and that will give me the pyramid or tower effect. So it gives you the effect of the tree shape. It's a good idea before you get started to practice. Stand them up on top of each other and see if you can check that you've got a reasonable graduation in size as you go up and down. It just saves you time. It's not essential, but it just means that when you thread them on, you know you're not going to have to unthread them because you've done them in the wrong order. You'll need a couple of small ones, or smaller ones. They don't have to be that small. These ones, I use some tiny ones, and they're going to make your tree trunk or base. Those ones were quite small. These ones I used some slightly bigger, but still smaller than the bottom button, and those will make the appearance of a tree trunk. So like I said, you need one to go at the top to make your tree topper, and then you're going to need some thread or string or even ribbon. So I'm going to have a go at making a blue one. So because some of these have reasonably standard holes, I could probably choose anything, but some of the really tiny buttons have really quite small holes. So if you have a thick string or yarn, you might find you'll struggle to thread that through. So I've got some cotton. If you've got wool, that probably work quite well because often that will stretch a little bit and so it'll fit through. And you'll need a needle if you're using cotton. You might have something like this. This is a piece of sort of basic ribbon, and this isn't a brand new piece. You can tell it looks a little bit ropey in a couple of places. This was from a packet of fabric. It just was used to wrap it up. Sometimes you get these on gift sets, things that you might have that you're left over from birthdays or Christmas. Often they have little decorative bits of ribbon, not always as long as this, but if it's long enough you can certainly use those. But as I said before, you just need to be able to feed it through whatever holes you've got in the buttons you're going to use. Ribbon's often quite handy like this because you can actually give it a bit of a twizzle and it will curl up quite thinly. So you might find, although it's obviously wider than the holes in the buttons, it will still go through. So for the blue tree, I'm going to use a thread, and I'll need a needle, and I need to make sure it's, again, one that will pass through all of the holes in the buttons that I'm going to use. So I'm going to slide these ones out of the way for a minute. So what I want to do, because the cotton thread, this is quite strong, but it is obviously quite thin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a double thickness. So I'm going to take about 2 foot, so about 24 inches of cotton, and I'm going to thread that onto my needle. And then I'm going to take the two ends, the two loose ends, and for the moment I'm going to just tie a knot, and I'll show you why in a second. It's not going to be to hold your buttons in place, it's just going to be to make sure that the thread doesn't come apart, so it keeps the two strands pretty much together. And then as I'm working, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hook the knotted bit over my thumb. So when I put my buttons on, it basically just means that they're not going to drop off the other end while I'm working. So what we need to do is think about the order that they're going to go together, and you want to start with the smallest one, so the one which is at the top. Some of the buttons will have a decoration, Some of them have different colours or textures. I'm just trying to find one. I don't think I've got one. Some of them have a completely different effect on the underside. So you just need to decide which is your top and which is your bottom, and take your needle and pass the thread from the top through to the bottom on any one of the holes. And you're going to do that all the way down through each sized button until you've got them all on your thread. And the beauty of having your finger hooked through the thread is you shouldn't lose them. They should stay where they are. So you should be able to have them all attached on your thread, and you can get a rough idea. So at this point you'll be able to see if you don't like the way you've put your colours on, if you've got different ones, or you think perhaps the sizings are not quite tiered up how you'd like, you can take them apart at this stage and then you haven't got too much of a hassle. Once you've got all your tree buttons on, then you need to think about your bottom, your tree trunk. So I'm undecided, which shall I use? I think I might use the grey beigey sort of buttons, and I reckon probably 3 or 4 small ones. Again, you might find some of your buttons, depending on where you've got them from, some of them are going to be thicker than others. So just have a look, decide which ones you want. Probably having them a similar size works quite well, so that you get the effect of a tube rather than a stand. And then pop those on. So now we're going to go back. So we need to go back up from the bottom all the way back up to the top. So if you let them spread out a tiny bit, not too much, because that's when you probably find they'll shuffle about and you'll be more likely to end up putting them back on the needle in the wrong order. So you need to make sure you do them in the same order that you did before, or in reverse. And this time we're going to come back up. So if you've got a button with 4 holes, like this one, you want to come back up through the hole which is diagonally opposite the one you used first time around. If you've only got 2 holes, well then it's easy. You don't have any choice. But what you need to do is make sure that your thread goes back up the other way, so the opposite direction to how you did it on the first pass. And you're going to do that all the way up back to the top. Again, make sure you keep your thumb hooked in the thread so that you don't lose any as you're going, especially if you've had them sorted and put into the right sequence. The last thing you want is to have to not only thread them again but restack them in the right order. I've done that a few times. It's soul destroying. Almost there. So once you've got all of them threaded, you should have no loose threads running out of the sides. They should all be pulled straight through. So there's my tree. I'm not quite convinced the top of my tree is as narrow as I would really like. I think I would have liked another one, but that's okay. So now I'm going to decide which of the other buttons I'm going to put on the top. But what I want to do first is secure these so I don't lose them. So I'm going to tie a double knot, and that should just keep the buttons that are on there fairly tightly in place. Okay, so there's my tree. So then I'm going to decide which of these I think I would like as my tree topper. I quite like the yellow one, I think. Or maybe the red. Let's go for the red. So this button, it doesn't have ordinary holes. What it's got is a channel at the back. So what I can do here is take my needle and thread and pass that onto the cotton. So because that works by going through the back, the button won't lay flat on the top. It should, when it's hanging, it should hang upright. If you've got one that's buttons with holes like these, what you'll perhaps need to do is make sure that you pass the cotton through and leave a tiny bit of slack so that it can hang. We don't want this one to come off, so we're going to do another knot to keep this in place. So I'm going to tie, a knot through the top just above where the button is. That should hopefully keep it all in place if I don't get my needle all tangled up. In fact, let's cut that off for a moment. So who thought it would be so fiddly? And I want to try and make it that the knot fits reasonably close to where the button needs to be, because then it will stop it from bouncing up too high. So that's that bit, and then I need to make the loop big enough to allow this to go on the tree. So how long you want it is probably dependent on how big your Christmas tree branches are. If you've got big chunky Christmas tree branches, you might want a longer stretch. If you have something like a natural tree, a real tree, you may not need quite such a long strand, as often they're a narrower cluster of branch to go over. And there you go. So you can pretty much go with whatever colour scheme you like. Let's say if you've got a specific colour scheme you want to work with, you might need to go out and buy buttons to suit. But if you're happy, so these other ones here that I'm going to have a go at probably next time, kind of natural colours. By the time that stacks up, that's going to be a much more muted colour, but perhaps a little bit of purple or some greens or olives might just break it up. But it's not as bright as those, but that might suit people. Some people might prefer that slightly more natural look. I could even do my little buzzy bee to go on the top instead of a star. I've seen on Pinterest, I've seen people do them using white buttons in various sizes, so going from small to slightly larger and then smaller again, and then doing the same again for the top to make a snowman. So a body with a coloured bead for where the neck would be to make a scarf, a little head, and then instead of having a star like on the top of the tree, you might want some black beads to go on the top, and then they can look like a snowman's hat. Pretty sure that you could probably just make any sort of shape. You could, if you have a mixture of sizes, you could go from small out to large and back again and have it look a little bit like a bauble. Have a go, have a see what you've got, maybe think about how they'd work, or take a dip into a big old mixed pack of beads and see what bright, colourful, funky things you could do with those. Make sure you let me see what you've made and have fun.